B.1.5. How is the mass psychological basis for authoritarian civilization created? We noted in section 8.3.6 that hierarchical authoritarian institutions tend to be self-perpetuating because growing up under their influence creates submissive/authoritarian personalities, people who both respect authority based on fear of punishment and desire to exercise it themselves on subordinates. Individuals with such a character structure do not really want to dismantle hierarchies because they are afraid of the responsibility entailed by genuine freedom. It seems natural and right to them that society's institutions, from the authoritarian factory to the patriarchal family, should be pyramidal, with an elite at the top giving orders while those below them merely obey. Thus, we have the spectacle of so-called libertarians and anarcho-capitalists bleating about liberty, while at the same time advocating factory fascism and privatized states. In short, authoritarian civilization reproduces itself with each generation because, through an intricate system of conditioning that permeates every aspect of society, it creates masses of people who support the status quo. Wilhelm Reich has given one of the most thorough analyses of the psychological processes involved in the reproduction of authoritarian civilization. Reich based his analysis on four of Freud's most solidly grounded discoveries, namely, 1. That there exists an unconscious part of the mind which has powerful, though irrational, influence on behavior. 2. That even the small child develops a lively genital sexuality, i.e., a desire for sexual pleasure which has nothing to do with procreation. 3. That childhood sexuality, along with the Oedipal conflicts that arise in parent-child relations under monogamy and patriarchy, are usually repressed through fear of punishment or disapproval for sexual acts and thoughts. 4. That this blocking of the child's natural sexual activity and extinguishing it from memory does not weaken its force in the unconscious, but actually intensifies it and enables it to manifest itself in various pathological disturbances and antisocial drives. And 5. That far from being of divine origin, human moral codes are derived from the educational measures used by the parents and parental surrogates in earliest childhood, the most effective of these being the ones opposed to childhood sexuality. By studying Bronislaw Malinowski's research on the Trobriand Islanders, a woman-centered matricentric society in which children's sexual behavior was not repressed and in which neuroses and perversions, as well as authoritarian institutions and values, were almost non-existent, Reich came to the conclusion that patriarchy and authoritarianism originally developed when tribal chieftains began to get economic advantages from a certain type of marriage, cross-cousin marriages, entered into by their sons. In such marriages, the brothers of the son's wife were obliged to pay a dowry to her in the form of continuous tribute, thus enriching her husband's clan, i.e., the chiefs. By arranging many such marriages for his sons, which were usually numerous due to the chief's privilege of polygamy, the chief's clan could accumulate wealth. Thus, society began to be stratified into ruling and subordinate clans based on wealth. To secure the permanence of these good marriages, strict monogamy was required. However, it was found that monogamy was impossible to maintain without the repression of childhood sexuality since, as statistics show, children who are allowed free expression of sexuality often do not adapt successfully to lifelong monogamy. Therefore, along with class stratification and private property, authoritarian child-rearing methods were developed to inculcate the repressive sexual morality on which the new patriarchal system depended for its reproduction. Thus, there is a historical correlation between, on the one hand, pre-patriarchal society, primitive libertarian communism, or work democracy to use Reich's expression, economic equality, and sexual freedom, and on the other, patriarchal society, a private property economy, economic class stratification, and sexual repression. As Reich puts it, open quote, Every tribe that developed from a matricentric to a patriarchal organization had to change the sexual structure of its members to produce a sexuality in keeping with its new form of life. This was a necessary change because the shifting of power and of wealth from the democratic gens, maternal clans, to the authoritarian family of the chief was mainly implemented with the help of the suppression of the sexual strivings of the people. It was in this way that sexual suppression became an essential factor in the division of society into classes. Marriage and the lawful dowry it entailed became the axis of the transformation of the one organization into the other. In view of the fact that the marriage tribute of the wife's gens to the man's family strengthened the male's, especially the chief's, position of power, the male members of the higher-ranking gens and families developed a keen interest in making the nuptial ties permanent. At this stage, in other words, only the man had an interest in marriage. In this way, natural work democracy's simple alliance, which could be easily dissolved at any time, was transformed into the permanent and monogamous marital relationship of patriarchy. The permanent monogamous marriage became the basic institution of patriarchal society, which it still is today. To safeguard these marriages, however, it was necessary to impose greater and greater restrictions upon and to depreciate natural genital strivings. End quote. The suppression of natural sexuality involved in this transformation from matricentric to patriarchal society created various antisocial drives. Sadism, destructive impulses, rape fantasies, etc., which then also had to be suppressed through the imposition of a compulsive morality, which took the place of the natural self-regulation that one finds in pre-patriarchal societies. In this way, sex began to be regarded as dirty, diabolical, wicked, etc., which it had indeed become through the creation of secondary drives. Thus, open quote, the patriarchal authoritarian sexual order that resulted from the revolutionary processes of latter-day matricentrism, economic independence of the chief's family from the maternal gens, a growing exchange of goods between the tribes, development of the means of production, etc., becomes the primary basis of authoritarian ideology by depriving the women, children, and adolescents of their sexual freedom, making a commodity of sex and placing sexual interests in the service of economic subjugation. From now on, sexuality is indeed distorted. It becomes diabolical and demonic and has to be curbed. End quote. Once the beginnings of patriarchy are in place, the creation of a fully authoritarian society based on the psychological crippling of its members through sexual suppression follows. Open quote. The moral inhibition of the child's natural sexuality, the last stage of which is the severe impairment of the child's genital sexuality, makes the child afraid, shy, fearful of authority, obedient, good, and docile in the authoritarian sense of the words. It has a crippling effect on man's rebellious forces because every vital life impulse is now burdened with severe fear. And since sex is a forbidden subject, thought in general and man's critical faculty also become inhibited. In short, morality's aim is to produce acquiescent subjects who, despite distress and humiliation, are adjusted to the authoritarian order. Thus, the family is the authoritarian state in miniature, to which the child must learn to adapt himself as a preparation for the general social adjustment required of him later. Man's authoritarian structure, this must be clearly established, is basically produced by the embedding of sexual inhibitions and fear. End quote. In this way, by damaging the individual's power to rebel and think for him/herself, the inhibition of childhood sexuality, and indeed other forms of free natural expression of bioenergy, for example shouting, crying, running, jumping, etc., becomes the most important weapon in creating reactionary personalities. This is why every reactionary politician puts such an emphasis on straightening the family and promoting family values, i.e., patriarchy, compulsive monogamy, premarital chastity, corporal punishment, etc. In the words of Reich, open quote, since authoritarian society reproduces itself in the individual structures of the masses with the help of the authoritarian family, It follows that political reaction has to regard and defend the authoritarian family as the basis of the state, culture, and civilization. It is political reaction's germ cell, the most important center for the production of reactionary men and women. Originating and developing from definite social processes, it becomes the most essential institution for the preservation of the authoritarian system that shapes it. End quote. The family is the most essential institution for this purpose because children are most vulnerable to psychological maiming in their first few years, from the time of birth to about 6 years of age, during which time they are mostly in the charge of their parents. The schools and churches then continue the process of conditioning once the children are old enough to be away from their parents, but they are generally unsuccessful if the proper foundation has not been laid very early in life by the parents. Thus, A.S. Neal observes that, open quote, the nursery training is very like the kennel training. The whipped child, like the whipped puppy, grows into an obedient, inferior adult. And as we train our dogs to suit our own purposes, so we train our children. In that kennel, the nursery, the human dogs must be clean. They must feed when we think it convenient for them to feed. I saw 100,000 obedient fawning dogs wag their tails in the Tempelhof, Berlin, when, in 1935, the great trainer Hitler whistled his commands. End quote. The family is also the main agency of repression during adolescence, when sexual energy reaches its peak. This is because the vast majority of parents provide no private space for adolescents to pursue undisturbed sexual relationships with their partners, but in fact actively discourage such behavior, often, as in fundamentalist Christian families, demanding complete abstinence, at the very time when abstinence is most impossible. Moreover, since teenagers are economically dependent of their parents under capitalism, with no societal provision of housing or dormitories allowing for sexual freedom, young people have no alternative but to submit to irrational parental demands for abstention from premarital sex. This, in turn, forces them to engage in furtive sex in the back seats of cars or other out-of-the-way places where they cannot relax or obtain full sexual satisfaction. As Reich found, when sexuality is repressed and laden with anxiety, the result is always some degree of what he terms orgastic impotence, the inability to fully surrender to the flow of energy discharged during orgasm. Hence, there is an incomplete release of sexual tension, which results in a state of chronic bioenergetic stasis. Such a condition, Reich found, is the breeding ground for neuroses and reactionary attitudes. For further details, see section J.6. In this connection, it is interesting to note that primitive societies such as the Trobriand Islanders, prior to their developing patriarchal authoritarian institutions, provided special community houses where teenagers could go with their partners to enjoy undisturbed sexual relationships, and this with society's full approval. Such an institution would be taken for granted in an anarchist society, as it is implied by the concept of freedom. For more on adolescent sexual liberation, see section J.6.8. Nationalistic feelings can also be traced to the authoritarian family. A child's attachment to its mother is, of course, natural and is the basis of all family ties. Subjectively, the emotional core of the concepts of homeland and nation are mother and family, since the mother is the homeland of the child, just as the family is the nation in miniature. According to Reich, who carefully studied the mass appeal of Hitler's National Socialism, nationalistic sentiments are a direct continuation of the family tie and are rooted in a fixated tie to the mother. As Reich points out, although infantile attachment to the mother is natural, fixated attachment is not, but is a social product. In puberty, the tie to the mother would make room for other attachments, i.e., natural sexual relations, if the unnatural sexual restrictions imposed on adolescence did not cause it to be eternalized. It is in the form of this socially conditioned externalization that fixation on the mother becomes the basis of nationalist feelings in the adult, and it is only at this stage that it becomes a reactionary social force. Later writers who have followed Reich in analyzing the process of creating reactionary character structures have broadened the scope of his analysis to include other important inhibitions besides sexual ones that are imposed on children and adolescents. Ryan Esler, for example, in her book Sacred Pleasure, stresses that it is not just a sex-negative attitude, but a pleasure-negative attitude that creates the kinds of personalities in question. Denial of the value of pleasurable sensations permeates our unconscious, as reflected, for example, in the common idea that to enjoy the pleasures of the body is the animalistic and hence bad side of human nature, as contrasted with the higher pleasures of the mind and spirit. By such dualism, which denies a spiritual aspect to the body, people are made to feel guilty about enjoying any pleasurable sensations, a conditioning that does, however, prepare them for lives based on the sacrifice of pleasure, or indeed even of life itself, under capitalism and statism, with the requirements of mass submission to alienated labor, exploitation, military service to protect ruling class interests, and so on. And at the same time, authoritarian ideology emphasizes the value of suffering, as for example through the glorification of the tough, insensitive warrior hero who suffers and inflicts necessary suffering on others for the sake of some pitiless ideal. Eisler also points out that there is, open quote, ample evidence that people who grow up in families where rigid hierarchies and painful punishments are the norm learn to suppress anger towards their parents. There is also ample evidence that this anger is then often deflected against traditionally disempowered groups, such as minorities, children, and women. End quote. This repressed anger then becomes fertile ground for reactionary politicians, whose mass appeal usually rests in part on scapegoating minorities for society's problems. As the psychologist Else Frankel-Brunswick documents in The Authoritarian Personality, people who have been conditioned through childhood abuse to surrender their will to the requirements of feared authoritarian parents also tend to be very susceptible as adults to surrender their will and minds to authoritarian leaders. Open quote, in other words, Frankel-Brunswick summarizes, at the same time that they learn to deflect their repressed rage against those they perceive as weak, they also learn to submit to autocratic or strongman rule. Moreover, having been severely punished for any hint of rebellion, even talking back about being treated unfairly, they gradually also learn to deny to themselves that there was anything wrong with what was done to them as children, and to do it in turn to their own children. End quote. These are just some of the mechanisms that perpetuate the status quo by creating the kinds of personalities who worship authority and fear freedom. Consequently, anarchists are generally opposed to traditional child-rearing practices, the patriarchal authoritarian family and its values, the suppression of adolescent sexuality, and the pleasure-denying, pain-affirming attitudes taught by the church and in most schools. In place of these, anarchists favor non-authoritarian, non-repressive child-rearing practices and educational methods, see section J.6 and section J.5.13 respectively, whose purpose is to prevent or at least minimize the psychological crippling of individuals, allowing them instead to develop natural self-regulation and self-motivated learning. This, we believe, is the only way for people to grow up into happy, creative, and truly freedom-loving individuals who will provide the psychological ground where anarchist economic and political institutions can flourish.